information always manifests itself. You cannot suppress it. In the period when the information is suppressed, the popular rumor makes it worse than it actually is. And then when it finally does emerge, those who suppress it are discredited by the effort to suppress it. And those who sought to inflame it are validated by the act of suppression.
This episode of Wrong Speak is brought to you by the Montreal-based law firm of Goldwater Dubé. And if you're wondering why a law firm would support a podcast like Wrong Speak, well, you're not alone. So I put the question to managing partner Daniel Goldwater.
Well, John, my understanding of your audience is that these are people who are drawn to conversations about difficult topics, but conversations that are informed and that are civil and that produce a new truth. It's sort of like a dialectic tension between 2 points. So it strikes me as actually very similar to litigation.
Hey, I could talk about dialectics all day, but how does what you hear on Wrong Speak connect to your work as a lawyer?
The issues I see every day as a lawyer really are issues related to family breakdown. So that involves divorces, it involves battles over custody, the best interest of children, religious and minority rights. We've done charter challenges, some big files, in fact, that have gone to the Supreme Court. And we also have a practice in animal rights right now, which really provokes some compelling questions about where our law is going. So I would say that the everyday issues are telling the stories of my client and telling them with confidence and clarity.
What's the best way for listeners to get in touch with Goldwater Dubé?
Just run a Google search, Goldwater Dubé. Don't worry about the funny accent on the E. Just write D-U-B-E. And you'll go to our nice website. I think it's nice. And just call us. We'll figure it out.
Daniel Goldwater of Goldwater Dubé, thank you so much for supporting Wrong Speak.
It's a pleasure, John.
I'm Dr. Debra So, and this is Wrong Speak, the podcast about the things we believe to be true, but cannot say. We're here today with David Frum, who's a senior editor at The Atlantic, a veteran conservative pundit and book author. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking about the limits of respectable discourse, especially among conservatives. Now, John, you and David are no strangers. You worked together for about 10 years at the National Post.
That's right. David was one of the columnists who was part of the National Post newspaper here in Canada when it was founded in 1998 and continued to be a big presence at the Post. At the time, I was just starting my career in journalism. Eventually, David and I both left the National Post, but it's been amazing to watch the trajectory of his career. He's remained an incredibly relevant commentator and critic, especially among conservatives, has an incredibly popular Twitter account, and has landed at The Atlantic, which, of course, is one of America's best magazines. Before we get into the questioning, though, I just wanted to tell listeners, if it sounds like we're recording this in a public space, we are. We're on the mezzanine level of a big Toronto hotel, which ended up being the perfect spot to catch David as he was en route through Toronto. So apologies for the background noise, maybe the occasional music that you hear. It's all part of this public space where we're recording the podcast. Now, without further ado, let's jump into some of the questions. And David, I'm going to start with something very general, which is about your role and the role of the pundit class in general in this weird time we inhabit. Going back to the 90s, I think politicians were the respectable ones, and often it was conservative pundits who were often flying off the handle with all kinds of weird ideas. Now it seems to be reversed in this weird world we inhabit, where people like you and other members of the pundit class at Atlantic Magazine or National Review, they're the adults in the room, and they're trying to police the discourse of politicians like Donald Trump. Would you agree with that way of characterizing things?
I've never thought about it that way. Let me try an essay at an answer. I don't think that Donald Trump's behavior will be much imitated by other politicians, because I think even from his point of view, his behavior is self-defeating. If he spoke less, if he were less provocative, he would be more popular. He would have more room in which to do the bad things that he wants to do. And many of the bad things he wants to do are inhibited by the bad things he says. And so future politicians will be more careful. But what I think is true is that a lot of the accustomed taboos that we're familiar with in the English-speaking world are crumbling. And they're crumbling, I think, for two main reasons. The first is the multiplication of media platforms. I mean, it used to be that media had quite restricted entry, or mass media had quite restricted entry. Now there's no limit. So all kinds of people who just wouldn't have been booked onto television or radio when television or radio was a big centralized institution, those people now have the same access to the mass market as the most powerful institutions. So the advent of social media and the deconcentration of media power is one reason that the limits are down. And the second reason is a social change, which is as we become a more diverse society, as we lose the concept of a majority, an ethnic or religious or cultural majority, people who belong to what used to be that majority say, why can't we have the same low standards for what we say as those who have challenged majorities have in the past? Why are the rules different from us? Why do we have to be so polite? Isn't that an inheritance from a different era?
Would you say that your presence as a conservative, as a pundit, as you work at the Atlantic magazine now, which is not a conservative, but I think your conservative presence there, is part of your career as a pundit now policing the boundaries in this new era? Because I do hear you all the time calling out important people, conservatives, whether in think tanks or politicians, who are crossing the line as you see it. And later on we'll talk about what those lines are, but is that part of your role now as a pundit?
Look, we all do it as human beings, that we see something that's hurtful or cruel, just mean. I mean, you and I are talking just hours after the Trump White House very flamboyantly refused to engage in ceremonial mourning for John McCain. The White House flag was raised back to full staff within hours of Senator McCain's death. But I'm not a believer in calling out people. What does that do? And indeed, what happens is you get these infinite loops in which, the calling out can be as abusive as the original incident. So I'm interested, and I'm not just interested in speech, I'm interested in how do you reassert norms of government, of personal behavior in a time when they're under pressure. I think for all of us, and I do not always or even often live up to the standard, but here's the standard I aspire to. I think we all need to police our own behavior more and other people's behavior less. I so often fall short of the standards I'd like to believe I have or the standards I espouse, but I think again and again about how do you just do it right yourself. And if we all thought more about how you do it right yourself and left it to the other people to do the same for themselves, this would be a better world.
So while we're on the topic of Trump, I'm curious, very few Republicans have been willing to criticize him publicly since the election in 2016.
Yeah.
What makes you different in that regard?
I think I've been different from other Republicans for a range of reasons. One is I've been in institutional places where I have, just not to be a hero about this, I have fewer risks. I mean, if you're a Republican office holder, if you work in the conservative ecosystem where your readers or your donors are so passionately pro-Trump, you have less room than I do working at the Atlantic. The people at National Review really, I mean, you've seen it. I mean, National Review did a special issue just in the middle of the election against Trump. I think they had 27 contributors. Fewer than half of those contributors still oppose Donald Trump. The others have more or less grudgingly, more or less enthusiastically made their peace. Some of them very enthusiastically made their peace. And I'm sure they're, to a great extent, sincere, but they're also subject to pressures that working at the Atlantic I'm not. So that's, I think, one reason. The second is because I've spent so much time in the 2 years before 2016 thinking about the problems of countries like Poland and Hungary and Central Europe, I saw where this train was heading early. And Donald Trump is not just a flamboyant loudmouth, nor is he just a dishonest, shady businessman elevated into office the way, say, Silvio Berlusconi was in Italy. I mean, he's part of a global trend away from democratic self-government, limited self-government, and liberal ideas. And if you spend a lot of time in Hungary and Poland, you've seen where the end of the parade is.
And so what would you say to other conservative Republicans who might feel the same way as you but who aren't as vocal?
I've had this conversation on occasion with office holders, and my advice has depended on the circumstances of the person. In some cases, I tell them, don't be a hero. If you are a person in state office, if you're 30, you're not going to achieve anything by public criticism of the president. All you're going to do is blight your own prospects. If you're a better kind of person than Donald Trump, the right thing for people who are early in their careers, who are at the state level, where they can't make an impact anyway, is just don't endorse him. stay clear, be a different kind of Republican, and be ready for the time when you'll be needed. In other cases, you have to say to people, you have power. One of the people I've probably been toughest on, because he's a good leader, is Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
He's a senator from Tennessee, I think?
He's a senator from Tennessee.
He's announced that he's leaving, though, right?
He's announced that he's leaving. So he's got nothing to lose. Outgoing senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's the job that William Fulbright had when he went up against Lyndon Johnson over Vietnam, that Henry Cabot Lodge had when he broke Woodrow Wilson over the League of Nations. It's a powerful, powerful place. Why can't people who hold those offices use them? That's a different question from the 32-year-old in the Nevada State Legislature.
So we're having this conversation in Toronto, and so I just want to broaden this a little bit before we get into specific issues like religion and race and that sort of thing. Because I want to talk a little bit about how the dynamics of a political system affect this phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Because in the last few days, you had primary races, I think it was in Georgia, where the leading Republican was talking about how he was going to get into his own pickup truck and round up illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you had, I think the leading Democrat was striking essentially like an outwardly socialist posture, like saying things that the Democrats haven't been saying for decades. Is it the case that the primary system in the United States, redistricting, it's having a centrifugal effect? And just the Canadian counterexample is we just had a conservative political convention here in Canada, a federal one, where anything but the most mainstream soft-boiled conservative ideas were systematically airbrushed out of the agenda, along with, of course, Maxime Bernier, who was a dissident conservative, I think he's left the caucus now. Like these two things are happening at the same time. Is that just because because of party dynamics within these two systems?
Well, there's a dynamic that should be familiar to anyone who's observed complex democratic systems, which is when you have a lot of access, a lot of elections, a lot of participation in the context of low general interest, you empower extremism. That's why, one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn...
That's the United States situation.
Well, there's a lot of... Jeremy Corbyn... That's how you get Jeremy Corbyn. That Labour said we will elect our next leader, not in the old way, but with one person, one vote, in a system where the public interest is low.
This is in Britain.
In Britain. Jeremy Corbyn now wants to apply this to the Board of Governors of the BBC, elect the Board of Governors of the BBC. Well, that guarantees that there will be extremists, because who is going to bother to study the identities of these people to cast a ballot? People with vested interest. So one of the things that, American so-called reformers have for a long time been saying the secret to improving American politics is to open it up, give more and more people more and more access to the levers of power. But those more and more people do not in fact show up. You get oddballs. And so I think one of the lessons to take is that America's idea of political reform and the kind of reform that Labour pursued in the United Kingdom is wrong-headed, and that things like superdelegate and minimizing the number of elections to those positions where people are truly interested can stabilize systems. I think there's also something else going on, which is, again, this is a social media effect. I'm not going to remember off the top of my head how many elected officials there are in the United States, but there must be tens of thousands. I think it's probably always been true that a certain number of them were wacky, and especially if you count the nominees, the people who are not going to win. Lots of them were wacky. You didn't used to find out about them. Now, because of social media, if somebody who's running for the state assembly in Georgia and who's probably going to lose says something crazy, you hear about it on Facebook or Twitter, and you instantly get outraged, and that condemns that person, but it also normalizes.
Or the governor of Maine is a good example.
Well, he's an actual governor.
But he's an obscure governor of an obscure state, but he gets a lot of press just because everything's on YouTube now.
An actual governor, then I think that is an indication of a genuine problem. But the fact that there is some, candidate in a Republican primary in a state who's a weirdo, that doesn't necessarily tell you that the country's full of weirdos.
While we're on the topic of social media, what do you think about the recent censorship of Alex Jones on YouTube and Facebook?
It's not censorship. It's simply not censorship. If I'm running Safeway and I become convinced that the almond milk my supplier is providing me is not safe for my customers, I have no obligation to stock the almond milk. They say, look, we've got lots of milk here. We've got soy milk. The almond milk is available somewhere else. You want to go get it, you can. But we at Safeway, we do not think this almond milk is consistent with our standards. Is Safeway censoring the almond milk? No, they are a platform. I would oppose arresting or punishing Alex Jones for anything he has to say. If the state were to apply sanctions to him for non-libelous speech, he is in danger he does have a series of defamation lawsuits against him. That's not censorship. He said on a public platform hurtful and untrue things about the parents of those children massacred in that horrible crime in Connecticut. He has to take a stand on that. And I don't think it's reasonable to ask people who provide platforms to say, here's this character who routinely defames people and routinely subjects you, behaves in ways that would subject you to legal risk if you were not specifically immunized by federal law from being sued for defamatory things said on your platform. I think they're absolutely within their rights. I think they're doing something commendable. I wouldn't carry Alex Jones on my platform.
I'd like to ask you a question about something that happened a long time ago. I think this is maybe before your political consciousness, but there was another period in conservative ideology when there was a sense that the oddballs had to be silenced or marginalized in some way. I'm thinking, I don't know if it's the late 60s, early 70s, when some editors at the National Review realized that there were a lot of anti-Semitic crackpots in conservatism. And there was I'd say a largely successful effort to put the John Birch Society types and some of the other oddballs, make them more marginal. Do you think there's any lessons that can be learned from that period that could be applied today, or is the media landscape just too different?
That's not the analogy I would choose, partly because the John Birch Society was not very big or important, and partly because it understates what is really at stake. I think the analogy to the problem that the right-hand side of the political spectrum faces today is much more like that of the 1940s, when the left-hand side, when social democrats had to deal with the fact that many of their supporters and much of their infrastructure were infiltrated by communists. And people who are not committed to the democratic system. And unlike the John Birch Society, where, look, if an editorial in a magazine can deal with a problem, it's not a very difficult problem. What the social democrats across the world, in Great Britain and the United States, had to do dealing with this internal problem of communism, where they often shared criticisms of the status quo with their communist colleagues. They often found them admirable people, the most committed. Often the communists were people who had better records in the 1930s against Nazism and fascism. But there that you are in 1947 or 48, and you realize these people are not committed to a democratic legal system, and you had to deal with that. And that was a very challenging argument. And I would say to this larger problem of the anti-democratic right, which is growing up all around us across the Western world. This is a problem not specifically for conservatives. It's a problem for political systems generally, and as communism was in the 1940s. And this points to, and I may be anticipating a question here, the way countries like the United States and Great Britain and Canada dealt with, and even more on the continent of Europe, dealt with the communist challenge after World War II was not simply by scolding communists or even by punishing them. It was by identifying places where the communists were saying things that resonated, where they found true grievances, saying, we will also meet those grievances. So if the communists are saying, the problem with capitalist society is it collapses into periodic depressions that throw a third of the population out of work, they're not wrong. So you say, okay, well, how do we reform our capitalist system in ways that it doesn't do that, in the 1930s and the 1890s and the 1870s? If the communists are saying, people who get old should not have to rely only on their own savings and go hungry if they don't have enough, or people get sick, it's on them to take care of their treatment. If the communists are saying those things, the answer is not to say, well, we won't care about those. It's to find, well, let's find non-communist ways of taking their supporters away from them. And that is the challenge today with demagogues don't become demagogues by talking about things people do not care about. They talk about things people do care about. And if people care about immigration, if they care about identity, if they feel that their elites have lost concern for ordinary people, hear that, and to defeat them, take away their issues.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you about feminism, which you've written about previously.
Yeah.
Do you think the Me Too movement has helped women?
Yes, very much. And I think one of the cycles of the Me Too movement is there'll be a series of absolutely horrifying stories. And there'll be some petty incident that'll get some media attention. And people then say, has the Me Too movement gone too far? And just as you're taking in breath to answer that question, there was the revelation of another horrific atrocity. So I would say I have a daughter in her mid-20s in the workforce. I have a daughter in her late teens, soon to enter the workforce. They're very well spoken. They have a lot of advantages in life. They nonetheless, especially my elder daughter, encounters things once a week that it's absolutely staggering to me that any human being should have to put up with. So I would identify the Me Too movement it reminds me more of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I mean, obviously the anti-drunk driving movement can go to ridiculous extremes. But in general, a world in which drunk driving is taken seriously and in which there's a lot less of it is a better world than the old world in which Dean Martin regularly made jokes about drunk driving on the number one comedy show on the #1 channel.
Part of the reason we wanted to talk to you, David, is because we're interested in your view on when it's legitimate to push back against these movements that we all agree are virtuous and necessary. Yeah. So there are people who push back against Me Too, or if not Me Too specifically, but the larger idea that society is becoming feminized or men are becoming, the idea of manhood is becoming pathologized. Whether we agree with that or not, it fits in with your idea that sometimes the demagogues they tap into real grievances or real perceived grievances. But even Jordan Peterson here in Canada, some people attack him as being misogynistic. I'm wondering what your take is on where is the boundary of respectable discourse in the pushback against what is perceived to be feminist advocacy.
I've had occasion to discuss this question with some of the executives at Twitter. And I think the general rule always is behavioral standards, not content standards. If people harass, if people abuse, if people swarm, you can write neutral rules to govern those behaviors. And even if you can't write the rules in advance, you can identify abusive behaviors and you can offer cogent general explanations of why a certain behavior is not acceptable. So I don't think Twitter should be deplatforming, and this should be deplatforming people merely for having extreme views, even in Alex Jones. I mean, the problem with Jones was he was literally defaming people. And that's an objective standard. So he's not deplatformed for being crazy. He's being deplatformed for saying that grieving parents are consciously lying about their grief. That's defamatory. I think there is a question mark about the role of men in the modern world, but that is a consequence, I think, of changes in economic structures where male labor is becoming less valuable relative to female labor than it used to be. And so the family structures that had existed for a long time that were premised on the idea that a man's labor outside the home is going to be more valuable than a woman's labor outside the home, probably, and that the family has to build it. That's just ceasing to be true. And as it ceases to be true, the dynamics of family are shifting. And it's going to be very hard to build a new familial pattern that can accommodate this. And that's going to be the work of generations. And I think one of the ways that the feminist category of issues are maybe very different from the race category of identity issues is there is no way of escaping the inherent mutual dependency of men and women. And ultimately, they have their interests are congruent. Both want to live together happily. And so as you see boys being lost, I think, and again, it's not a matter of policing the boundaries. I just think whenever you present this as a zero-sum game, what's good for boys is bad for girls, or the other way around, you're missing the boat. Because what we want are boys who can be good husbands and girls who can be good wives, and both of them who can be good parents, and they're going to have to do it together.
What do you think the feminist movement can do then to help support boys and men?
My late mother, Barbara Frum, one of her early journalistic efforts was charting what had happened to the charities that had been set up in the early 1960s. They had been set up long before, but in the early there had been charities set up to cure tuberculosis. And by the early 1960s, tuberculosis was cleared. Was cured, and people didn't get it anymore. But the charities didn't want to go out of business. And so they began looking for new causes. Some of them made the transition to lung cancer, but some just became scams. And she wrote a big series of articles for the Toronto Star, and this is what made her first reputation. I think what happens with a lot of causes or ideologies is they come into being because of a set of circumstances. And they address a crisis of their times. They make an impact, they exhaust their raw material, and then they become kind of obsolete. I think that's very much the story of what's happened to movement conservatism, which was a set of ideas that addressed the problems of the 1970s. And here it is, almost the 2020s, and to the extent that there are ideas in movement conservative, they're the same ideas they had for completely different problems in the 1970s. And feminism, as we've known it, was a response to the conditions that women found themselves after the war, where we were moving from an economy of mines and mills and factories to a new economy of offices. And there was no reason that women couldn't participate as equals in the new kind of economy, and yet they were given the back of the hand. I think we are going to. I think the term feminism is going to be. Is left. You can see lots of women leave it behind because there's obviously something wrong between the sexes, but it's not the same thing that was wrong between the sexes as in 1970. My problem is not that I can't get a job on equal terms. My problem is I can't make the life I want because I'm not finding the life partners who are able to live with me, and that's a new kind of question. And so it's going to need a new kind of answer.
So moving from the hot button of gender to the hot button of race and creed and religion, here in Canada, the debate about the line between legitimate social criticism and Islamophobia has been going on for well over a decade.
Yeah.
There was a famous article by Mark Stein in Maclean's magazine, which really sparked that. It was another era because the enemy was then seen as the human rights commissions, and that was sort of before Twitter took off. I think we live in another era now. But I think conservatives in particular are still grappling with the question of what is legitimate criticism of a religion as a sociological artifact, and when does it cross over into bigotry? And I know that Donald Trump has said some things that, to my mind at least, were just flat out Islamophobic. Mm-hmm. Here in Canada, on the other hand, there seems to be like this hair-trigger response to even the most mild criticism of Islamism. Is this something, David, that you have thought about in terms of what you will say and not say about Islam or any other faith?
Well, as to faith in general, I, as a not especially Orthodox but believing Jew, I am constantly amazed by the ability of human beings to take books they believe to be divine and make out of them absolutely anything they want. It is just, you can read the Quran or the Bible, and if you are disposed to be a kindly, charitable, loving person, you will find all the support you need. And if what excites you is murdering your neighbors, you will find all the support you need there too. And that's true in every book. And you remember the joke about the doctor with the ink blots and he's showing them to the patient, and the patient has like one smutty reaction to them after the other, and the doctor finally says, "There's obviously something wrong with you." And the man says, "Me? You're the one with the dirty pictures." Okay, so that's what happens. Like, people make these decisions. So faith is what people make of it. And the idea that you would say of any faith, that it's inherently anything. I mean, I just imagine God's reaction to this is, pretty obvious what God wants. I want you not to commit large-scale massacres. Is that so much to ask? And meanwhile, I'm the God of 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. It's just statistically probable that there's intelligent life on a lot of them, and they're all asking me the same question at the same time. Figure it out for yourselves. I gave you intelligence and opposable thumbs for a reason. So I feel for him. How do you solve these things? Look, I think one of the things that was a big problem in the aftermath of 9/11 was that governments thought the way to prevent bigotry was by not telling people the truth about the seriousness of problems around them. And we saw the German government do this with the mass influx of Middle Eastern immigration after the Syrian civil war, and especially in 2015. And I think we are seeing some episodes of this in Canada, where the Canadian government tries to suppress information. And one of the things you just have to understand in the modern world, information always manifests itself. You cannot suppress it. And in the period when the information is suppressed, the popular rumor makes it worse than it actually is. And then when it finally does emerge, those who suppress it are discredited by the effort to suppress it, and those who sought to inflame it are validated by the act of suppression.
What should the public do in that case when information comes out that seems to confirm the idea that they're being lied to? Instead of, I guess, disregarding the credibility of the source?
Well, we all need to be, in the internet age, we all need to be very careful. And one of the responsibilities that is on each of us in the internet age is we are all publishers of news as well, and distributors as well as consumers. So, you may think, well, gee, I've got a Twitter feed with 272 people. Who am I? But the fact is, when information comes your way, there are 272 people, and if each of them have 272 people and so on, rumors can spread very rapidly. So I think we all have a duty to be careful about what we pass on, because we do not want to be conduits of rumor and innuendo, and we want to be responsible news users. And that said, I think the authorities would do well to face up to real problems promptly, and they should have a little bit more confidence in the level heads of people. They can understand that a problem is a real problem, that there is a problem of extremist Islam. There are tendencies toward violence. There are some ways to predict who's going to be caught up in this violence without it implicating everybody. I mean, and community standards are useful if they get community leaders, in this case leaders of the Islamic community, to make an extra effort to monitor the people they know for signs of dangerousness to society. But obviously we believe guilt is individual, not collective.
You've written previously about cultural appropriation, and you've said that the way forward is for us as a society to champion respect and tolerance.
Yeah.
So what can we do to help facilitate this?
Well, a lot of these things come down to just, can we be sensible? So the cultural appropriation debate begins, I think, with some true instincts, which is there are ways that people in one group can use the culture of another that are insulting and demeaning, and by the way, and intentionally insulting and demeaning. So if you're a frat brother at the University of Arizona and you put on a sombrero and a poncho and you act lazy, you're being insulting, and you're being insulting. But what then happens is this spreads into a grant of permission for people to be jerks to one another. And I wrote about this in the context of, there's a young woman who, for her prom in Utah, bought a Chinese dress in a secondhand store, posted some pictures of herself on it. She looked delightful with her friends. Obviously, it's an important moment in her life. Why would you be mean to her? And yet somebody with a large following chose to. And what happens what makes these debates so ultimately bizarre is it turns out the people who are defending the culture usually know nothing about it. And the example I cited was a student at Oberlin who protested against the cafeteria's appropriation of a Vietnamese sandwich called the banh mi. Okay, you're nodding as if you know. So a banh mi sandwich is a slice of baguette with pate and then other sort of Vietnamese area. So anyone who thinks, wait a minute, pate? Baguette? And that what the Vietnamese did was they appropriated a food of their colonizers, changed it for local conditions, and then enjoyed it. And then a Vietnamese diaspora then re-changes that in their, to make, because they're different of things that are available in a North American grocery store than are available in very warm and humid Vietnam. And this is the story of culture. One of my favorite books about this is a book on Indian food by a brilliant historian, Lizzie Cottingham, where it just points out how Indian food is not an eternal thing. All the influences on it. And this book has made her the most execrated person not the most, but an execrated person in English. She points out, that lamb vindaloo, what's more Indian than that? Except, as if you think about the words, it's from the Portuguese word for a dish cooked in wine and garlic.
The example you give of Oberlin College in the United States is a good one, and I think there is a sense that even on Twitter, I think there's a sense that progressives might have overshot the mark a little bit on the cultural appropriation argument. But again, to draw the conversation back a little bit to the political situation here in Canada, we're having the interview. Conservatives seem to be attacked in the media whenever they go after even what, to my mind, are obvious excesses of progressive obsessions on anything to do with diversity and multiculturalism. Justin Trudeau's Liberals seem to have successfully baited several conservative politicians on this file. As a conservative in a left-wing country like Canada, and I guess European countries that also are on the left, do conservatives just have to bite their tongue sometimes when it comes to criticizing diversity gambits on the left, simply because they know they're going to be attacked? Even here in Canada, the National Post, even conservative pundits are always cautioning conservative politicians to just go with the party line when it comes to anything to do with identity politics.
I think my advice to anybody in any situation would be, first, don't be a jerk. Just that's a general rule of life. Not being a jerk already, a lot of the things that happens, and a lot of these fights turn out to be that one person says something absurd or foolish, and another person then attacks them in a way that is mean and nasty and jerkish, and then everyone is called in to take up a pre-positioned point of view on this quarrel that is started by two people, both of whom are being, it's like the great powers being dragged into the Balkans crisis in August of 1914. And at some point you have to let Montenegro and Croatia fight it out without being drawn. But I would say, as in everything in life, when you take part in a debate, think about why you're doing it. Think about what you want to say. One of my rules on Twitter, and again, I don't always live up to this rule, but it's a rule I try to follow, is no arguments about arguments. I try to say, keep focused on what the underlying issue is. The mere fact that there's someone in the vast world of the social media who's behaving stupidly, how can there not be? Am I supposed to correct and chastise every one of them? And am I so sure that I'm the person who's not behaving stupidly that I have the right to do that? So if you have, you've written, John, so hilariously about these native religious rituals done by non-natives before secular gatherings. That's a great topic. Write about that. And you can write about that without being a jerk. It is absurd. And it's also, by the way, wholly improper, because if these are religious rituals, a secular event should not begin with any sectarian religious ritual of any kind. You wouldn't, unless you're going to have them all, unless you're going to have the, like that Hail Caesar moment with the Protestant minister and the Roman Catholic padre and the Greek Orthodox, unless they're all going to be there, none of them can be there, obviously. So fight that. But it's also always possible to fight your battles with mutual respect and tolerance and without being insulting. And I think that you instanced before Mark Stein's battles with the Human Rights Commission. I think generally in a free society, there are a lot of things you have the right to do that you need to ask yourself whether there's a necessity for you to do it, and how you would like it if somebody else exercised their contradictory rights in the same way and in the same manner as you're about to exercise yours.
You mentioned earlier that you've spoken to Twitter about the kinds of guidelines that they should potentially take on. What kind of suggestions would you give to social media more broadly?
I think the Facebook has very different problems, because Facebook has been such a bad actor, but I think one of the things we need to put on the table, the political world, is social media exists and is profitable because in 1996, the federal government, in one of its many laws governing this new thing called the Internet, said if you are a platform, you are not a publisher. So I can defame people on Facebook, and Facebook is not liable. That's a grant of permission from the federal government, and that could be taken away. And if that law were repealed, the courts would have to decide, is Facebook a publisher or not? You periodically, you hear about these terrible stories that there's apparently a website where people who women who believe their husbands have cheated on them with other women can post stories about other women, predatory women. And the site operates no standards at all of veracity. And there's a tremendous story, I think, in the Wall Street Journal recently about a woman who was named completely delusionally on this site and who then had, terrible things happen to her. And it comes, and you could never purge it. That exists because whoever was the Internet service provider, is not a publisher. They don't have any obligation to check. So one of the things we can say to all these companies is your business model, where Facebook has no editors, is based on a grant of authority. And if you want to keep it, you need to think about what your responsibilities are. And that means making some effort not to defame people, not to be used by hostile foreign intelligence services. And it also means, by the way, I think that you should have some ethical obligation at least, and maybe some legal obligation, to be clear with your customers about what information you're taking of theirs and how you're using it.
A few days ago, David, somebody suggested that I get on a social media service called, the website is gab.ai.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's called Gabber, but it's Gab. They call it Gab. And the ethos of the site is 100% free speech. Like, anything you want to say goes. There's no censorship whatsoever, which to my mind sounded like a fantastic idea until when you go there, you find that there's a lot of Holocaust deniers.
Yeah.
Because they're like, hey, finally a place that lets me be me.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, David, you've been fighting the free speech battle longer than I do. There are people on the left who say, free speech has just become a banner for hate. It sometimes feels like they have a point. Has free speech, does it have a bad name now?
It is true. When I hear somebody say, yeah, my issue is free speech, I always think, so what's this thing you want to say that you feel? Like, I say a lot of things. I make my life saying things. And maybe I should be a little insulted by this. I've never, no one has ever even wanly protested. I've never even had trouble finding a parking space in any of my campus events. Am I that boring?
But 20 years ago, you would have been seen, at least by Canadian standards, as maybe, if not radical, but that right wing, sort of a red meat conservative. Whereas now, I don't think you've changed much, but you're an establishment conservative from an ideological point of view.
But one of the things that has been part of the decline of conservatism as a school of thought is, it used to be that conservatives had a lot of views about how to make the economy work better, how to make health systems work better, what kind of weapons your armed forces needed, how much or how little you should spend on armed forces. And all of those were backed up with some degree of intellectual rigor.
It's like the American Enterprise Institute circa 20 years ago.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what has happened with it is, first, many of those arguments conservatives won. In fact, probably the majority of them. So the conservative ideas stopped being exciting because no one was arguing against them anymore. There's no
welfare reform and that kind of.
Who thinks that wage and price control? The economy is moving into a period of higher inflation. Who thinks that wage and price controls are the way to deal with it? Gas prices have spiked. Who would suggest that the government should tell energy companies what they should charge for these things? There was a time, not so long ago, when people thought that was a good idea. Yeah, the idea that can you fight crime by putting more criminals in prison? There are obviously costs and consequences to putting criminals in prison, but we now accept, that will work, even maybe at unacceptable cost, but it will work. So conservatives won a lot of these arguments. One of the things I am struck by with this phenomenon, you've heard it described as the intellectual dark web, a range of thinkers who are interested.
Debra and I have been accused of being on the IDW.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I don't know whether it's an accusation or a compliment, but the thing that is striking about it is, almost without exception, they're not interested in anything that I would call politics. They're not interested in health care reform. They're not interested in the federal budget. They're not interested in how do you make infrastructure work better. All the things that I think of as the stuff of politics. What they're interested in are arguments about arguments. They're interested in, if I can use this term for an ethnic group, why can't I use that term? And that's what you say, all this, and we live in a society in which it's pretty easy to speak your mind. In fact, the reason that the free speech issue has come a little bit to the fore is more people than ever have been given more power of communication than ever, and unsurprisingly, a predictably large number of them have not used that freedom wisely. And so we are now debating how people can use that freedom. But you are suspicious, whatever the freedom is. I don't want to police anybody's clothing choices, right? You can wear, it's not my business what you want to wear. And if people say, right, we believe in a society where people can, and that's why I intend to go to church naked. You think, okay, look, the police, well, maybe they will arrest you for that. But really, you have to go to church naked? You really have to do that?
I guess in defense of the IDW, I would say some of the ideas that, I can't speak for the other individuals, but some of the ideas that we're speaking about should not be considered controversial because they are based in fact. Mm-hmm. So I'm really surprised to hear that you don't feel you've ever been censored. There's never been a time where you felt...
I didn't say that.
Okay.
But what I don't feel... I've never been censored. I have sometimes been subjected to criticism that I thought was unfair, got over it. I think one of the things, if you're going to go into the punditry business that you absolutely need is a thick skin. There is a kind of person, and I can think of a few, who I think one of the great things about the English language is our word sensitive has two meanings. You can be sensitive if you're alert to the feelings of others, and you can be sensitive if you're alert to your own feelings. And what the most gentlemanly person is the person who is excruciatingly sensitive to the feelings of others and completely indifferent to his own. And I think we could all just... So, yeah, of course we've all been subject to criticism, or we've been misunderstood, or maybe we said something that we shouldn't have said and we were rightly understood. What I do think I worry about a lot is that there's this industry of people who go out there to provoke, and then like soccer players falling to the ground at fake injuries, then when the provocation has its impact, then say, look at me, look at me, look at me. I think just generally, to go back to the thing I said at the beginning, in every kind of study of behavior, turn the gaze inward. You're going to criticize yourself. If we all were monitoring our own behaviors and not those of others, it would be better.
That can be taken to the pathological extreme where you interrogate your white privilege 16 hours a day, and you end up at a place like Oberlin College.
Well, that's true. As I have said on Twitter, maybe offensively, I never check my privilege for fear that the hat check girl will lose it amidst the top hats and opera capes.
Okay.
Okay, let me say something about that. Actually, let me say a serious thing about privilege. My late mother used to quote to me, I didn't know it was a quote when she began saying it, the opening paragraph of The Great Gatsby: whenever you are minded to criticize anybody, be aware that not everyone in this world has had all the advantages that you have had. Now, that's kind of more complex and ironic statement than my mother meant for me to take it literally, and it's more but so obviously many people have advantages in life. I don't think a white skin alone is such a big one, but it's a little, in some situations it can be a little bit of one. There are other privileges that are more important, and God knows I've inherited more than my share of those. So you can respond to that with guilt, or you can respond to that with responsibility. And one of the things that I think is really evil, and I use that word advisedly, about the interrogate your privilege culture, is it actually exonerates people. That we live in a time of extraordinarily rapidly widening class divisions, where the people with the most are farther away from the people with less than ever before. And they seem to have less responsibility about it than people in their position in North America and Great Britain did 50, 60, 70 years ago. So we do have a real problem about privilege bearers properly understood. You need to be responsible. That famous line from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what," that actually was borrowed from the address the headmaster of Groton used to give to the incoming class. So obviously there are a lot of advantages. Ask what you can do for others, and that we should be asking people with advantages to be conscious of it. But to turn it into a weapon rather than a call to action, that doesn't do any good. All it does is makes people defensive, and it becomes completely opportunistic, and it turns into, this is Film Festival week here in Toronto. I was walking past a big billboard on the way here, and it was full of slogans, all of which are basically slogans for, I belong to this group or that group. I would like more development money for my movie, please.
In your role as an editor, what kind of topics are hard-nosed for you?
Well, I have a title as senior editor at The Atlantic, which needs to change because I actually don't do any editing. and I get a lot of unsolicited manuscripts as a result.
But I think you were, at least briefly, the editor of was it The American Spectator?
I ran a website for 3 years called From Forum, where I was editor, and I've played editorial roles at many times over the past, and I was an editorial page editor on the Wall Street Journal in the early 1990s, and at a moment of crisis in the American Spectator's history, I was considered as a possible candidate for editor, but it never worked out.
But you've had opportunities to think of red lines or hard nose, not hard nose, but hard N-O.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what that list of topics are. Like when people say, no one's writing about X, I'm going to be like, what's X1, X2, X3? What are the things that you're just like, that's not something we're going to run? And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about just subjects that just aren't productive parts of conservative discourse, even though maybe they're persistent obsessions.
Well, I would need a lot of persuading ever to run an article about saying anything negative about an individual person who is not in a very high office. And,
like the hit job, a lengthy hit job.
Yeah, I mean, so it turns out the Assistant Secretary of State was not as big a war hero as he indicated. I would take a lot of persuading. Because people's reputations are so easily bruised, and I wouldn't. And unless it's really important, I'm not going to put in the effort to find out, is this absolutely not only true but fair. So I'd be very protective of individual reputations. And then there are a lot of things I wouldn't publish because they're outside my area of expertise. I mean, generally, I personally am always wary whenever anyone has an article about scientists being wrong about something. Not because scientists aren't often wrong about things. I'm sure they are, but I would not be a good editor for that. I just don't know enough to evaluate whether you're making a smart point or a foolish one.
The specific example in that latter respect would be someone saying anthropogenic global warming is nonsense. I think the Wall Street Journal still runs articles questioning that. Is that fair game? Is the whole? I'm not talking about at the margins about the temperature effect. The actual existence of man-made global warming, is that fair play?
Let me put it this way: if you had someone who's a real scientist who is not on the payroll of someone who wanted this view to be spread, and who had new information that advanced even his wrong point of view, yeah, of course. But the problem what you discover is, I know that most of those who do write these articles flunk those tests. They're either not scientists or they are on a payroll.
It's like the geologist who runs a blog or something like that is sort of the standard model. Sometimes I see.
Yeah.
And by the way, the same thing happens on the left when you have people who aren't scientists talking about how GMOs are bad.
Let me give you an example. What I would not publish, and actually there was someone at the National Post, I believe, who's written about this. I would not publish an article about vaccines. Because
you mean criticizing the efficacy of vaccines,
right?
Okay.
Because not only do I know as close to a fact as I can that this is wrong, and unlike the anthropogenic argument, the anthropogenic are almost certainly wrong, but not completely certainly wrong. The vaccine deniers are certainly wrong, but it's worse than that because they can influence behavior in a way that is destructive of children's welfare. So I would be. Someone might read the article and not vaccinate his or her child, and I would feel responsible for that. I would not publish that. I think in general, it's always here's the I would not have, if I had been in Andrew Sullivan's chair in 1996, I don't think I would have published extracts from the bell curve. And yet, if somebody had...
In what capacity was Andrew Sullivan?
He was editor of the New Republic.
Okay, editor of the New Republic, and of course he's since gone on to be a famous blogger.
Oh, yeah, he's a brilliant man and a good friend of mine and a great and courageous voice. And he published big extracts from the bell curve in a liberal magazine. I'm not sure I would have done that, but I would not because there are problems of tendentiousness in that book. But if somebody... there is... it's a fact that there are group differences in performance on standardized tests. So if somebody had a responsible assessment of why that's so, I would not be afraid to publish it. But I need to know you're a real scientist, you really know the material, You're not here to be disrespectful of other people, and you're not on anybody's payroll.
It could be on a future interview. Debra might have a lot to say about some of the censorship that takes place within science itself from her PhD years. But
I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah.
Because we do actually see scientific papers coming out that are not fact-based, that are being ideologically motivated. And so that's my concern, I suppose. But I understand where you're coming from in wanting to have a legitimate expert speak on these issues.
Yeah.
But it's
well, I'm not speaking
muddied.
about editing a scientific journal where there are other standards. And I'm something that I would be competent at, which is obviously a different floor of the building from the things you're competent at.
Yeah, and sometimes, by the way, these things take place at the level of funding or peer-reviewed juries and that sort of thing. But yeah, probably best left for another episode. I'm just going to, if I may, I'd like to finish with this, which is that in terms of what you can say, what you can't say, I think all of us probably are guilty of at least one hypocrisy. I know I try and interrogate myself ruthlessly for that. But David, I'm going to end with a tough question, which, no podcast is complete without mentioning Israel, of course.
Yes.
And I remember there was one recent tweet from you, David, that really caught my eye. You were talking about Sacha Baron Cohen, if I'm getting his name right.
Yeah.
The famous comedian, performance artist. And his latest shtick is he's pretended to be this Israeli security expert, and he comes to America, and he does what the interviewee thinks is a legitimate interview about gun control. And there's one thing that was making the rounds, went viral, where some hardcore NRA type, and Sacha Baron Cohen was pretending to be an Israeli who was advocating arming children and all sorts of ludicrous and macabre ideas. And I remember, David, you tweeted...
I didn't love this.
Well, you didn't love it, but I think I remember the language. And you didn't say, by the way, lock him up or censor him or anything like that, but you said you didn't like the fact that Sacha Baron Cohen was imposing on, I think you said, the goodwill of Americans toward Israel.
Yes. Because
he was presenting himself as an Israeli security expert. And the larger issue is sort of the double standard, maybe not from you, but I know that here in Canada there's lots of people who present themselves as huge free speech champions, but as soon as there's a Palestinian group on a Canadian campus that advocates for BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, suddenly they turn into, like...
Okay. Let's take this on too.
Is there a blind spot? Is there a hypocrisy for a lot of conservatives on the Israel issue?
So very specifically on that tweet, and my children who disagreed with me accused me of having a ghetto mindset, and I admit I do a little bit. What I envision there is, so Sacha Baron Cohen has very effectively ridiculed a person who agreed to the interview because he admired Israel. And I then have vision of that person, like as he copes with the wreckage of his reputation, saying, who am I going to blame for this disaster that has befallen me? I know, it's the Jews. And so I do have a little bit of sense of, this thing I was talking about with the Islamic community as a Jew, I care a lot about our, and we're a very vulnerable group, and I think we've been in a real zone of safety as a community, and I think in the United Kingdom and in other places we are moving somewhat out of the zone of safety we enjoyed for the half-century. Things against Jews that were once unthinkable are thinkable.
In Europe, certainly, although I would argue against that in North America.
I think not in North, but in Britain, things have become thinkable that were once unthinkable. So I would wish that Sacha Baron Cohen could make his comedic point. I'm obviously not going to stop him from doing it, but in a way that didn't leave a lot of people being much angrier at Jews in Israel than they were before. So that is a bit of a ghetto mindset, but I've inherited it. And this, I think, the thing that non-Jews have sometimes some difficulty comprehending about what has happened to modern Jews. I mean, we're both safe and not safe. I mean, I was born in 1960. There have been situations in the conservative world where I've heard things that I didn't like, and I think on one occasion I was in a position where I didn't get a job that I was interested in because of being Jewish. But in general, my life has been completely free of anti-Semitism. It's never been a limiting factor for me. On the other hand, the reason I'm here speaking to you is because my grandfather made the decision to leave Poland in 1930. And had he not made that decision, my grandfather not made that decision, my grandfather would have joined almost all of his siblings in being murdered in 1941 or 42. My father, who was born a year after the family got to Canada, I think that my grandmother was pregnant with him when they moved, would have been shot or killed in 1941 or 42. So it's both far and close. And that influences a lot of my thinking. As I said, I have never been in any important way impinged on by it. But I'm conscious that I would not be here but for this freakish accident. My grandfather did not do what his siblings did. As to Palestinian advocacy, I think say what you want about the state of Israel. Go ahead. Organizing economic boycotts or academic boycotts is slightly different from saying what you want. I think there's a big difference between saying, in my opinion, Israel is an apartheid state, than from saying we need to use the resources of the university or the state to single out Jews from Israel and deprive them of the right to travel. It's a different thing from saying, I think men, in my opinion, men have systematically oppressed women for centuries. As for saying, we need to organize groups of women to go into men's dormitory. This is now becoming a far-fetched analogy, but one is a call to action and a call to persecute people who are at a disadvantage. So say what you want about the state of Israel. I mean, I won't agree. I may contest it vigorously, but BDS is not about speech. It is about imposing economic boycotts and interfering with people's legitimate civil rights to travel, to teach, and so on.
I think that's all of the questions that we have. Is there anything else that you would like our listeners to know? Oh my gosh, what a workout this has been. I think I've said this 3 or 4 times. I'll say it again. I think we should all, when we think about the standards, the number one topic of whose standards are to be policed are your own. Look inward. Ask yourself whenever you speak, and ever you speak anything. We're coming up to the Jewish High Holy Days, and there's a midrash that is preached at that time, which is person comes to her rabbi and says, I've said something cruel and untrue about my neighbor. How can I make redress? And the rabbi said, I have a penance for you. Go get your best down feather stuffed pillow and bring it to me. And the woman does. He says, now take out a knife and slice open the pillow. And she does. And shake it everywhere. And she does. He said, now go retrieve all of the feathers and put them back in the pillow. The point is, once you've spoken cruelly, you can never retrieve the word. And that's true on Twitter, that's true on Facebook, that's true in life. And when we're thinking about what we want to see, let's begin by doing the thing we want to see.
You know, we didn't intend this to be a High Holidays edition of Wrong Speak, but we back into that, and we're going to own it. David, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast, and safe travels back to Washington. And we hope to see you here back in Toronto next Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We're going to make this an annual tradition. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you. Bye-bye.